pioneers of the astronomy at the beach at Island Lake Recreation Area. For many years, we were over at Kensington. So, like I say, Diane is one of the main people that make that a go.
Thank you, John. Yes, I've had the pleasure and honor of working with John and with Bob McFarland and Doug and some of your other members for many years now on outreach events at both the Metro Parks and now at Island Lake State Recreational Area. So, okay, showtime. So, 12/27/1968, the day the USSR lost the moon race. And you say, but wait, we just had up on the screen July 20th, 1969 was the day that Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon. So what are you talking about? Well, I'm talking about Apollo 8. We just had the 50th anniversary of its successful return. 3 astronauts went to the moon, orbited the moon, came home safely, read some Bible verses on Christmas Day along the way, and sent the USSR space program into a tailspin. Everybody was told to go home, rest. The cosmos could wait another couple of days. How do we know this? We know this because of very juicy diary entries that were left by the equivalent of the chief cosmonaut. We'll talk about him more in a little bit. But we've got some inside sources, heavily redacted, mind you, that indicate that this was the crushing blow to the Soviets, not what would happen in July of the following year. So, Soviet Union got off to a great start. First satellite in orbit, first dog in space, first man in space. What happened? There were so many problems that I could keep you here until sunrise, and we probably wouldn't discuss every root cause of why they couldn't get to the moon before the US. Project management, meddling, design philosophy, acts of fate, you might call it. But one way to get to the bottom of it is to look at the narrative of the space program. Probably almost everyone in the room can remember the US followed this linear path. Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, 1-man crew, 2-man crew, 3-man crew, basic space flight, more complicated missions, actually getting to the moon. If you look at the Soviet program just on paper, you would think that it's a similar trajectory from the 1 cosmonaut Vostok capsules to the multi-person crew Voskhod missions to the Soyuz, the most successful spacecraft of all time still in operation today. That's not really what was going on.
Yeah.
So, Vostok was simple. Put a human being in space. First a man, then a woman. Voskhod multi-crew missions didn't really have a clear objective. They were looking for a reason to be doing these other than political stunts. Meanwhile, they've got 2 separate rocket bureaus working on 2 separate moon rockets and 2 separate lunar spacecraft simultaneously. One of them, officially called the UR, or Universal Rocket 500, is better known today as the Proton rocket. The other one was a massive Saturn V-sized beast called the N1. Why would you do that? Well, let's just say that they did things differently in the USSR. So it wasn't for lack of resources. They had more people working on the program than the US did. Keeping in mind that the US had about 6% of the GDP spent on the moonshot mission at the time. We're talking a lot of people, we're talking a lot of dollars and or rubles. But the Soviet project bureaus were in competition with one another. This was something that had existed during and after World War II, during Stalin's era. They kept that. You had a charismatic, singular individual, a chief designer, capital C, capital D, driving the bureau. Well, that has its inefficiencies and its problems. So here are 3 of the guys in our rogues gallery. You've got Sergei Korolev there on the left, Valentin Glushko on the right and a guy named Vladimir Chelomai in the middle. Didn't help that these men kind of hated one another. Why did they hate one another? Well, back in 1938, Glushko denounced Korolev during Stalin's Great Purge and had him sent to the Gulag.
That's a good reason.
A really bad Gulag. Now, Glushko went to prison camp too because that was part of the whole thing with the Great Purge. You didn't get off easy. But he got a nice work camp. Korolev went to a place that was so bad it permanently ruined his health. Are they going to get along after the war? No. Meanwhile, Chelomai wasn't quite as dirty, but he certainly knew how to play the game. He went and hired the son of Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev to give him a leg up on the other guys. This was an old hat trick that back in the Stalin days, you know, they would get the son of Molotov or Malenkov or all these guys, try to have your little blue chip boy in your bureau to make sure that you got the pipeline for funding. It was a game. So we got personality clashes, political intrigue, grudges. There's Khrushchev. Khrushchev was, I would say, mostly good for the Soviet space program in the sense that he was interested, he supported things. Was it exactly the same sort of support that, say, Lyndon Johnson gave the American program? Hard to say. He certainly had his own motives, showing up the Americans, showing the rest of the world how great communist technology was, but he was a factor in everything that was going on in the early days of the moon race. But design philosophy was a problem too. Take a look at that rocket. Who's seen the bottom of a Saturn V? Okay, 5 huge, huge engine bells. That's a lot more than 5. That's 30 NK-15 engines there at the bottom of the N1. Now that's Korolev's pet rocket.
Could you point out where the engines are?
These guys.
A lot of firing up.
There's a lot of firing up. That's a lot of things that can go wrong. Now, why would this happen? So Glushko was in favor of what we call hypergolic or self-igniting rocket fuel. The US used that too. We used that on the lunar lander that successfully went to the moon. Korolev hated hypergolic fuels. He thought they were toxic. They are.
Yeah.
Now, you might say, as his comrades said to him, if your cosmonauts are on top of a rocket that explodes on the pad, they're dead anyway. Why do you care? Well, he actually did care about what would happen to everybody else, including all the technicians, the residents in the area, everybody who had to clean up. Hypergolic fuel, in his opinion, was an environmental disaster waiting to happen. And he was not okay with that. He wanted to take the cleaner path to the stars. I have to admire the guy for that. So Korolev liked to play up the military value of what he was doing. He is the guy who got Sputnik up. He is the guy who got the first man in space. Obviously, there are military applications for this, but the military really wasn't fond of him. They said, he works for TASS. That's the telegraph agency of the Soviet Union. In other words, that's the guy doing stunts for the media. Chelomai, military didn't really like him either. Their favorite boy was a guy named Mikhail Yangel, whose thing was intercontinental ballistic missiles. That's what the military wanted. They didn't want dogs in space. They didn't want men on the moon. So 1961, dawn of the space race. Alan Shepard is about to go into space. Kennedy's issuing his challenge. Do we choose to put in the man on the moon because it's easy? No. Okay. Chelomai's bureau gets offered a sort of a collaboration with Glushko. He said, okay, we've got this rocket called the RD-70. We're going to rename it the Universal Rocket 500, okay? It's a giant intercontinental ballistic missile. And we're going to go with them to the moon with this thing. Straight to the moon. Chelomai says, sure, sounds good to him. And he gets to work on the Universal Rocket. It's 3 more years before Korolev's dream rocket, the N1, gets approval from the Kremlin. 3 years is a long time in space flight. 3 years is from the first men in space to America is going great guns in the Gemini missions. 3 years is long enough for Nikita Khrushchev to not be the premier anymore, and the whole political landscape is changing around these guys. But Korolev had the higher priority. Korolev gets the blessing for the moon rocket. And Chelomai is working behind the scenes on his toy. So the game plan is pretty convoluted. There's going to be circumlunar flights of an unmanned probe called the Zond. There's going to be a manned circumlunar flight. That's important to remember. That was an end in and of itself. Was not get somebody on the moon, but get somebody around it. And finally, there would be a manned landing. The lunar lander was given the name L3. Whereas with the American program, again, all of the steps that were happening in Gemini, rendezvous, docking, spacewalking, were all with the singular end goal of getting a human being on the moon. The circumlunar achievement was cool, but that was not an end game by itself. That was another stepping stone. They had a different approach. These are just some cool lunar lander designs that I found on a site called astronautics.com that has a whole bunch of Soviet archival stuff. America went through a lot of missteps on the way to the familiar spider-like limb that we all know and love, but I think some of these are pretty cool.
A lot of them look like Ray that'll take care of them. They look like bugs.
Yeah. They, I mean, they were serious. They were seriously applying themselves. There's been some things that I've heard of. Oh yeah, they weren't really serious about going to the moon. A, we'll get to that. B, they absolutely were serious. They had their best and brightest working on this. In fact, Yangel, the intercontinental ballistic missile guy, he even got in on the act with his lunar lander design, which you can see on the right there. That would have been what a human being would have traveled to the lunar surface in had the rockets functioned. So this was part of his Luni Korabi, or LK, was part of the L1 package. So that's the universal rocket, aka the proton rocket, with Yangel's craft. So this would be a joint Yangel-Chelomai-Glushko project. And then, meanwhile, Korolev had his own lunar lander design that has some similarities with Soyuz technology, which was another one of his babies, and it would have flown up on the N1 rocket. So you can see there on there's a comparison side by side with what it would have looked like fully assembled compared with the full Apollo gear, the lunar module and the command module. And you can buy models. Mike O'Dowd, a member of the Warren Astronomical Society who shares my love of the manned spaceflight program, he's got this. I think it's really cute. Mike also was able to lend me some very fascinating rare books that I used to help assemble this. But these are the dreams. Let's get back to Soviet reality. Who's heard of Zond? Okay, I know you in the back knows. Who else has heard of Zond?
That's like the doctor, wasn't it from the, okay. I'll go
Nobody's heard of Zond. That's unfortunate. It is, I would consider it the secret success of the Soviet program. This here is Zond 5. So Zond is a little confusing because the name just means probe. You could not get more prosaic. So Zond was applied to different Soviet space programs. It would be like if we had a second thing out there called Project Apollo. We're talking about the lunar Zond. So the lunar Zond put the first life forms around the moon successfully in September of 1968. 2 Soviet tortoises, you can see them there bottom right, steppe tortoises, were put on an unmanned craft and orbited the moon along with some worms and some seeds and soil samples. They landed safely on Earth, becoming the first life to go to the moon and back. Really cool, huh? Never heard of that, have you?
I never heard of that.
It's just completely slipped out of the memory.
I never heard of that.
there were a handful of articles last year commemorating the 50th anniversary of these turtles, but other than, it's just, we don't care. Now, when I say that they landed safely, you can see that the capsule, which again looks kind of like a Soyuz, it's another modified Soyuz, is in the water. Where do Soviet spacecraft usually land? Yeah, that was not supposed to happen. That was an error. Instead of landing on the steppes of Kazakhstan, they splashed down in the Indian Ocean. It took a long time to find them. Fortunately, turtles can get by without food and water for a while, and when recovered, they had lost a little bit of their body weight, but otherwise seemed happy and seemed to have gone on to live perfectly normal turtle lives. A human crew might not have survived that. There's some glitches in Zond. In fact, there's some concept art. Most of the missions of Zond 4 through 8 that flew during the late 60s had glitches or accidents or incidents. Zond 7 was a total success, but had these been manned, the casualty count would have been pretty traumatic for everybody. Also, had they been manned, they would have had no view. There were no windows, so it would have been a very boring ride to the moon. Unlike what the Apollo 8 guys experienced on their first orbital flight. So that's Zond. Kind of successful. Definitely getting there. Good technology. The Proton rocket is mostly working. The Soyuz capsule is mostly working. Mostly doesn't get you all the way there. Let's get back to Core 11, the N1. N1 is not as large as the Saturn V. It has more lift than the Saturn V. It lacks the payload capacity. When you're bringing humans to the moon and they need life support systems, you need all the payload capacity you can get. This is a problem. Trying to shave off what was needed to fit the parameters of keeping human beings alive probably compromised the rocket design.
Question.
Yes.
The Saturn V is to the left, correct?
Yes, Saturn V is to the left, yeah.
The other one, the Soviet, looks as big as the Saturn V.
It's not to scale.
Not that-
It's not to scale.
Oh, I wondered.
It was done to show you piece by piece what the design philosophy was. So you can see the 3 of the 5 large bells versus the halo of much smaller rocket engines, etc. The real big problem here, though, was simply that development in the Saturn V had started 4 years earlier. 4 years, again, is a very long time when you're trying to hit an arbitrary deadline of the dawn of 1970. So here's some basics of Soviet design that were a surprise to me when I first started researching this about a decade ago. One is automated controls, fully automated controls in the craft, very sophisticated. Another one is Korolev's insistence on non-toxic propellants and how that played out. And a huge one to me is how they did their test practices on these rockets. So we'll talk a little bit about each. So, Soviet space flight, Soviet spacecraft could fly themselves. That is how you could take, in the case of the early female cosmonauts, a factory worker with parachuting skills, put her in a spacecraft, have her fly successfully, and come home in one piece. The Vostok cosmonauts didn't fly.
No.
They weren't expected to. They were not allowed to. Were most of them test pilots? Yes. But you didn't have to be a test pilot. You didn't have to be any kind of a pilot. And so the Soviets were able to fly civilians. They were able to fly a range of diverse, by Soviet standards, peoples, and have different ethnic groups, different, both genders, etc., represented up there, because none of them had to have the piloting skills that were demanded of the very homogeneous US piloting corps. But all of that meant that something had to be capable of flying itself before it was even considered man-rated. So that took time. And that, by the way, is a philosophy that persisted well past the moon race era. Anybody remember the Buran, the Soviet space shuttle?
Yep, it was self-landing. And flying.
It flew perfectly all by itself. The American space shuttle needed a minimum of 2 people to fly and is the most complicated beast.
That really surprised me.
Yeah.
Back when it landed and they said it was soft landing.
Yes.
What, Soviets got that technology?
They had that technology. They were passionately committed to the automated controls. But in addition to it taking forever to get something man-rated, automated, and there's a juicy quote from Kamenin's diaries. It really upset the cosmonauts. It was a huge impact on morale. These people were bored. They're intelligent, they're good pilots, some of them are great engineers, they're going to school, they're becoming doctorates of engineering, doctorates of physics, and they can't touch their own controls. They can't fly. And a lot of them turn to really bad pursuits to alleviate the boredom. That guy in the middle there, Titov, second man in space, he racked up some hit-and-run accidents like you wouldn't believe. And so it was kind of sad. Don't recall if I introduced this guy, Nikolai Kamenin. He's the guy with the juicy diaries again. So we've got a lot of quotes from him illustrating that the individual morale problems that were going on with trying to keep his cosmonauts in line. And this guy, everybody recognize him?
Yeah. First man in space.
First man in space, hero of space, hero of the cosmos, Yuri Gagarin. Even he could not behave himself. And he was considered to be one of the most likable, charismatic, best-loved guys in the cosmonaut corps. You can see he got that diving off the balcony when his wife caught him with another woman when they were on a PR tour. So here's an important thing to understand is that the Soviet flyers, they were working the PR circuit from one end of the Soviet Union to the other after their flight. Their identities were kept confidential until they came back. After they came back, they were national heroes, and they were expected to work their butts off doing it. So they're not only bored, they're also kind of like touring circus freaks out there working the PR circuit. Did the American astronauts do it too? Yes, but they also were mostly put right back in the pipeline with the intention of getting them on the next space mission. It was a different way of handling people, and it was not very successful. So even their shining, brightest star had bad problems in the aftermath of his first flight. And he wanted to get back into space. And instead he gets PR tours and falling on his face in the rocks. So the rocket fuel. Anyone remember the old thing about Twinkies are made with rocket fuel and Twinkies are toxic? Okay. Twinkies are not made with rocket fuel, but hypergolic rocket fuel is definitely toxic and you wouldn't want to eat it. So Korolev said, no, I'm not working with this. I don't care if it's more efficient. I refuse to. Glushko, not that they were friends anyway, said, okay, I'm not going to help you. You don't get over your aversion to hypergolic fuels. I'm not going to lift a finger to help your rocket design. So he recruited a guy who was a jet engine designer. They were good engines. They were really complicated. Really complicated, tends to present a problem in actual field testing. And, well, we'll get back to the engines in a little bit because they had an afterlife greater than most of the program, but as they were working out the kinks, that was a hurdle, regardless of how noble his intentions were.
Real quick, did the Gemini use hypergolic fuels too?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, because that was a Titan missile, wasn't it?
It was an
Yeah.
ICBM.
ICBM.
Yep. And Russian ICBMs used all kinds of nasty things, and we'll touch on that briefly in a second. So here's the testing practices. This is a case of saving money on the front end costs you a lot of money on the back end. So what the Americans did was we tested the rockets one stage at a time. First stage of the Saturn V, second stage, third stage. First stage had a lot of problems. The main engines were very problematic. It took time to work out. But we weren't blowing up the entire rocket in one go every time one of the 5 engines on the first block failed. Soviets used artillery practices. You assemble a rocket, you launch the rocket, and you see if it blows. Sooner or later, you run out of rockets. If you only had 4 or 5 rockets to start with, that doesn't take you very long. So they weren't given the funding, despite all the manpower allocated to the project. They didn't have the funding to do step-by-step testing the way that Americans did. And that, to me, is one of the huge things that was insurmountable in this. That's a big explosion. That's an explosion. That is what happens when hypergolic fuel leaks out of a rocket when the technicians are fueling it and incinerates hundreds of people at once. This is not the space program. This is a military missile. The guy overseeing it was a man named Marshall Nettling, and this has gone down in history as the Nettling disaster because he was the idiot in charge of what was going on. This is Exhibit A and why Korolev was correct.
Where did that happen?
I forget which base actually. It happened I think it was 61 or 62, so it predates a lot of the rockets we're talking about, but it was such a disaster that the final death count is not accurately known.
It was at least 200 people.
It was at least 200, it might have been 3.
It killed a lot of their
And I'm not showing you the video because it was filmed. These poor technicians working on this rocket as it turns into a pillar of flame around them. So, again, the limitations of the Korolev's engines are clear, but he didn't want this happening to his people, or the technicians, or anyone around the Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. But then something happened nobody anticipated. Korolev kicked the bucket in 1966. Routine surgery may sound kind of creepy, like somebody was trying to off him. No, actually, the damage had already been done. He had a bleeding polyp. He went in for surgery. Bleeding polyp turned out to be a much more complicated tumor, which led to a much more complicated surgery. And he had a weak heart from his time in the Gulag, and he died. Now, his identity had been kept top secret by the Soviet government during his lifetime. He was referred to only as the chief designer. So in death, he became a celebrated hero of the Soviet Union, but his bureau was decapitated. And his successor, Vasily Mishin, was not the same caliber of man. Now, he was still working with all of the problems that he inherited from Korolev, including demoralized and unruly cosmonauts and wonky jet engines that are made to design a rocket, but he was considered a drunk by Russian standards. I married a guy who's part Russian, so I can say some things about that. He would not show up to launches when it was felt like he ought to. So people were not feeling that their new boss had their backing. And so he gets stuck with the title of the guy who lost the race to the moon. Does he deserve it? Not entirely, but he didn't help himself. And he didn't help anybody else. And then something really bad happened. So this guy here, this guy here, Komarov, very competent, very well-liked, very charismatic, pilot cosmonaut. Good guy, was the commander of the first Vostok mission, the first 3-man crew. He got picked to fly the maiden flight of the Soyuz. And the parachute didn't deploy on the way home. And he got turned into this. They did an open casket funeral, by the way. I did not show you that picture. So this was more or less the same time that the American program was nearly derailed by the deaths of 3 astronauts, including Michigan's own Roger Chaffee, in the Apollo 1 fire. The Apollo 1 fire caused the U.S. to step back, go back to the contractors, look at the Apollo capsule from the ground up, uncover the problems, get to the root of what really was going wrong, and make sure that the mission going forward was safe. The Soviets then really couldn't catch up with us because they had to do the exact same thing when Komarov died, plus they were deprived of one of their greatest pilots. So 1967 was a bad year for both programs. And then in 1968, the Soviets got what was probably the cruelest blow of all. Yuri Gagarin wanted to get back into space badly. He was a hero. He didn't have to, the way that John Glenn was never allowed to fly again after becoming America's hero. But he got back in the jet. He was doing training for his future as a cosmonaut. And in a training accident, his plane pancaked. He wasn't just their leading hero. He wasn't just their most loved cosmonaut. He wasn't just, by default, in a rather leadership-poor corps, the natural candidate to be the chief cosmonaut, the guy around whom everybody else coalesced. He was all of that. From the day that Gagarin died, the two most iconic living cosmonauts have been Alexei Leonov, the first spacewalker, and Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space who then went on to become an engineer. Those are still the two most iconic cosmonauts. They never had anyone of the same level to eclipse Gagarin.
Diane, what's the image at the top there? Is that a plaque?
Yes, we put a plaque on the moon in his honor.
Oh.
You didn't know that. And the guy that did the first spacewalk almost died too, so.
Leonov's still alive. He's still
No,
with
he
us.
almost died.
He almost
He
died.
almost
Yes,
died
it
getting
was.
back in the capsule because of the
It was an awful experience. Yeah, but he was, from that day on, he was basically the top guy in the cosmonaut corps, the guy who probably would have set foot on the moon had they got there. So 1968 was a really bad year. Kamenin said, we lost everything. So you open up with Yuri Gagarin getting killed, you close out with Americans, Lovell and Anders and Berman coming back safe from the moon. They knew they were in deep, deep trouble at this point. By the time that Apollo 10 launched, early in 1968, the cosmonauts knew that only another Apollo 1-style catastrophe would derail the Americans from getting to the moon in the summer. So you can see here, this is the dry run, this is the LEM of Apollo 10, going almost down to the surface of the moon, but not quite. Even if something terrible had happened with this mission, causing the Americans to stand down again, they knew they had about 2 or 3 years to catch up. But they tried. So they assembled the massive N-1 rocket in February of 1969, took it out to the pad at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, and lit her up. 12 kilometers above the ground, she exploded. Kamenin said, can never be a reliable booster due to inherent design flaws. But they still had several more of these. And with Apollo 11's launch right around the corner, they made one last desperate attempt. The diary entries for Kamenin are heavily redacted at this point. It's very difficult, even after records were released in the late 1980s, to reconstruct exactly what happened. It appears that they had assembled a crew and they thought about launching men on the rocket. One of them would have been Leonov, again, the default leader of the cosmonauts in the wake of Gagarin's death. Leonov had been taking helicopter flying lessons to prepare him for landing upon the moon. Fortunately, this was not manned because this happened. And I'll let this one, there's no sound, but I'll let this speak for itself. This is the second of the N1 rockets being assembled. You can see how huge those engines actually are, despite being small compared to the Saturn V. This is a very tense time for everyone involved, of course,
It
because
looks like
they
they
need to
have a
stay.
farmer's approach to things, you know, just take the tractor and dump it in the air, you know?
Now here we go,
Light it up.
July 3rd. You can see what a beautiful rocket that was. And that doesn't look very good, does it?
Boom.
That doesn't look good at all. That's bad. Okay. And then Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon 2 weeks later. They still had a couple more rockets. They launched 2 more of the N1s. Same thing. Not that bad of an explosion, but they all failed. Glushko took over the bureau. Vindictive to the end, he had the remaining pieces of the N1 converted into playground equipment, a band shell, ornamental signs for the people living around Baikonur. Nick Steves, the co-author of a very good, very new book on the N1, has a comprehensive gallery of the repurposed rocket fragments. Apparently the latticework fins on the side of it were very highly sought after. It was like an awesome source of ornamental metal that the civilians around the area just loved. But people just did their best to pretend that this never even happened.
These were parts of the ones that blew up?
Some
just
of
the
the
one
ones
they
that blew
assembled?
up, but there was also a fifth rocket that never flew.
Gotcha.
So it was whatever they had lying around. The order was destroy it, repurpose it, salt the earth, pretend like this never went down. But meanwhile, Chelomai is still out there and he's building a rocket. In fact, he's building a monster of a rocket. This is the UR, Universal Rocket 700. It's 9 proton rockets strapped together.
How we do it.
Yeah, why not? You know, one of them works. Okay, let's go with 9. This would have been powerful enough to simply leave the surface of the Earth and go right to the moon. No parking orbit, no rendezvous, just lift off and take you right there. He had a direct descent lunar lander. They were trying really hard. But again, it hinged very greatly on the personality of the designer. And Chelomai was just kind of a strange duck. He took a long time to get things going. Did he eventually get there? Yes. His problem-solving approach was kind of weird. He alienated people. Not in a nasty, malicious way, just, you know, there's something a little off about the guy. And so, while his designs were good, and ultimately he could solve his problems, he could perfect his design, he could make something that worked, it took a long time. And they were out of time. After a series of failures, Chelomai's proton rocket was perfected. Still in use today, arguably the most successful rocket in the history of mankind. It was not perfected until 1970. Again, the clock ran out. So the Soviet philosophy was that they would not announce the mission objectives until the mission objectives had been achieved, so they could always claim 100% success.
Yeah.
Since these programs were not successful, the party line was, this never happened. Soyuz worked. The Salyut space station worked. So the claim was, we weren't trying to go to the moon. We were just working along with Earth. Look, we've got this marvelous space station. You don't have a space. Oh, you've got Skylab. Well, Skylab is garbage. Look at our space station. Some people in the West believe that, and so you did see this perpetuated in books, that they weren't really trying, they weren't giving it their all, they didn't really want to go to the moon, they were just kind of stringing us along. Now, you've got, this is a page, a reproduction from Vasily Nishin's journal. He's got the crew selection. They meant it, they were doing it. And the US intelligence knew about it because it was awfully hard to cover up that N2 launch failure. That was one of the 10th largest explosions that ever happened. We knew they had something big going on, and we knew that something that big could only be a moon rocket or a Mars rocket.
But the general consensus, as I remember, was that before the Soviet Union failed, was that they weren't interested, and that was general lore in this country. They were not going there. The U.S. had a different plan, and it was not really a race. We weren't racing you.
And they did their darndest to convince us that that was the case because they failed.
What do you know about that?
Well, so the rockets blew up, but there's actually some engines. Those NK-15 engines that were at the big stage of the N1 rocket and the NK-33 engines. Well, funny thing happened with those engines. When Glishko said destroy everything, people didn't want to part with their engines. They hid them in what was called the forest of engines. And they hid them successfully for almost 3 decades. So, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the forest of engines was revealed to the engineering world, who were in disbelief. This is like finding the Loch Ness Monster. And they were still good. Maybe not in the context of an N1. This is an RD 180 engine, aka the design that was the NK-15 that blew up so repeatedly on the N1 rocket, being tested at the Marshall Space Flight Center in 1998. This was used by the United Launch Alliance for the Atlas V's. Still is. It works. And the NK-33 rockets, like this is from 2012. This is an Antares launch vehicle, the kind that services the ISS. Orbital Sciences was using Soviet vintage engines to get into space this decade.
Not just the design, the
The actual vintage 1970s engines.
I thought they took the design and repurposed a little bit, or did they actually use the?
They've done both.
Okay.
So both the NK-15, like the NK-15 evolved into the RD-180, but this particular case in the Antares, to everything I've read, these were actual vintage engines.
Holy crap.
Now, United Launch Alliance, or Orbital Sciences is phasing that out. They've actually contracted with Blue Origins, so they're going to be making American-produced engines instead of the old Soviet ones. And I found it interesting that the fuel that they're using in these new generation of engines, liquid oxygen and methane, non-toxic fuels just like Korolev would have wanted.
Did we get a good deal on those, like buy one, get one free?
I don't think they got that good of a deal, actually. Some of
Blew
them,
up, right?
and some of them blew up, yeah.
Well,
They're not perfect.
when the Soviet Union collapsed, correct me if I'm wrong, there was a big mass of like sell everything. Make money, like a big sale.
Well, yeah, like the RD-180s, they're actually produced by the SP Korolev Energia Bureau. So the man's been dead for a real long time, but he's still got his name on the factory producing these things. So, my main takeaway from this was, even if you take out the bad blood and the backstabbing and drunken cosmonauts and all the rest of it, the biggest problem the Soviets had is they just started too darn late. 1964, when Korolev got the blessing from the Kremlin to go for broke, it was too late. The Americans were already so far down the road with the astronauts, working on Gemini, learning to dock, learning rendezvous, learning spacewalking. It never would have worked. But you might want to ask yourself what could have happened if back in 1961, instead of letting these guys fight it out amongst themselves for a decade, if they'd started off with one program, one goal, and the kind of discipline that we had here in the US. So I've got a little video by Nick Stevens, who did this fabulous book, N1 for the Moon and Mars, that contains a lot of his concept art. And I don't know if it'll play because of lack of internet here, but I did try to download it. So, let's see. Right.
Cool.
Hope you enjoyed that look at a future that never happened. Any questions?
I have a couple, if you don't
Oh.
mind.
Yeah, sure. Can we get the lights?
A couple things, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Number one, just real quick, were there people, I was told that people might have died before you went up. In other words, the first cosmonaut. That there
Okay.
might have been some, that they covered that out, number one. Number two, we had so much technology to get us there. We had all kinds of systems. We had lots of food behind it. We had navigational computer. We had horsepower computers. We had radar. We had observation centers all over Earth. I just never understood how the Russians, how they were going to land on the moon, even with all the automation. We had close failures. We were lucky to have as many people go there without the failures, in my book, because it was
We were lucky.
we were very lucky.
Very
And the
lucky.
bottom, and if everything would have happened, would have been the end of it. It almost did in 13. But the end result is, I always wondered how the Soviet Union had the technology to even consider that they could actually navigate land and do all the things they were going to do.
Well, they
Unless
actually,
they thought the people were.
they had other allies. Remember that even though we view ourselves as very much on the right as far as the Cold War go, we were very
Correct.
proud of our allies. They had allies too. They had a station in Cuba, a relay station.
Yeah.
That wasn't there originally, but once they got that online, that really helped their ability to communicate. So they were counting on, just as we counted on relay stations in the Canary Islands and all over the place to be able to talk to the astronauts, make sure that they got home safely, etc. They were also depending on a similar network. To your point about the covered up deaths, so there was one verifiable death that occurred. It was a very young Ukrainian astronaut named Valentin Bondarenko, and he was training in an oxygen-rich facility when he very unwisely stripped off an alcohol-saturated little pad of some kind that was used on a sensor and threw it too close to a hot pad. Well, in an oxygen-rich environment, he went up like a torch, and so he did not die immediately. He was very badly burned. He had trained with Gagarin, so he was visited by Gagarin in the hospital, but he did pass away. Since the identities of all pre-flown cosmonauts were confidential, he was never acknowledged. He was buried. He was a military pilot, so he was simply buried, and back home in Ukraine in Kharkov, and that was that. Now people have said, well, if the Soviets had actually traded information with the Americans, about the hazards of an oxygen-rich environment, maybe Apollo 1 wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, really.
Yeah, maybe not. Now, he's the only death. However, their policy of writing out inconvenient persons meant that there were a lot of cosmonauts who disappeared from the records, including being clumsily airbrushed out of photos because they strayed from the party line, or they had too many drunk driving incidents, or they were just nasty people, or anybody who was found to be unsuitable. If they weren't already a known personality who would come back safely, they got sent back to go fly fighter jets over North Korea, and they got disappeared. So there were a lot of redacted records, there was a lot of covering up, but Bondarenko is the only confirmed death that I've been able to find.
Okay, one last question.
Sure.
Thing. Are you familiar with the manned spy platform that they were supposed to put up?
Almaz.
Okay.
Almaz. So Almaz is fascinating. Almaz actually developed into, in various branches, the later Salyut space stations, the Mir 2, and the Zvezda module on the ISS today.
Oh,
So
really?
even though it wasn't really any more functional for a military spy operation, it had these kind of crap little lasers in case we decided to start an inner space battle with them, like start. Yeah, okay. The Air Force here had its aborted manned orbital laboratory that we wanted to get platform in space. They wanted a platform in space. Didn't work, but the Almaz technology was very good, and in a sense is still with us today on the ISS and Zvezda.
Okay. That's
I think-
interesting, because most people don't know about that spy platform that we tried to develop too.
Right, yeah.
Before we had automated, or,
Well, we didn't know for years that, I think it was Salyut 4 was basically Almaz.
okay.
They weren't going to publicize that. I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was just wondering, you said the rockets were automated to fly on their own?
Yes,
Do you know if the lunar modules were supposed to do the same thing?
yes.
Okay,
So-
so they're gonna do that.
If anybody's familiar with the landing of Apollo 11, there was this really tense moment where Neil Armstrong looks down and realizes he's about to be planted in the middle of a boulder field, takes the manual controls and pilots it safely. Cosmonaut would not have been able to do that. On the other hand, and if you were sharp-eyed with the video, you'd see that there was a little craft sitting there waiting.
Yeah.
They had rovers. They deployed rovers on the moon. So they would have had a rover sitting there, check it all out, make sure it's a nice flat field, the rover's relaying the information feeds the computer, and they have a beautiful, fully computer-guided landing with no
So basically, they
problems.
put the landing computer on the moon and then land it that way. Is that what you're saying?
Well,
Like a
the
beacon,
rover
yeah.
would have verified that
Yeah.
the landing field was clear.
Well, that's a good way
It's
to do
good
it.
technology.
That's good technology.
They ran out of time.
Yeah, okay. No,
Yes.
that clears
And
it up.
they did send rovers.
Yeah, they had
They,
two.
they put
The
two
Lunicod
rovers.
rovers, yeah, some of the most
Shortly-
successful.
I'm not gonna say right after, but shortly after our moon.
Yeah, the two of the most successful planetary rovers of all time, really. Yeah, the Lunicods were great. And again, not really well known here. We're not really inclined to celebrate the good stuff that the Soviets
Do
did.
they have videos of those rovers going?
Sorry?
Do they have videos of those rovers
I don't
going
believe
around?
there's videos, there's some still photographs, and there's some photographs taken by the Zonk mission, which, while it didn't have windows in the craft, there was a camera on the outside. They're not great cameras, but that's one of the reasons that the far side of the moon, the craters have Russian names. It's because the Soviets had spacecraft that got up there, took a look and said, hey, we're claiming all these craters before we got there. Yes?
It seems very ironic that the communist space program had such a competitive streak with all of these people, trying to pose different visions, and the U.S., the capitalist power, had a very strong top-down, no dissent allowed culture. Is there anything that you found about that? Because the Soviet program looks like a capitalist model, and the American program looks like a communist model.
So
does.
what I found from looking into the pre-Sputnik era of the space flight of these bureaus, these OKBs as these design bureaus were called, I'm going to blame Stalinism. As far as this nasty, roughhouse, backstabby thing, that all was well in place before the space race. And so I don't know whether you could just say it's a toxic byproduct of the regime that Stalin had going, or whether you could say that, well, actually there's a whole lot of hypocrisy going on where they were implementing communism, and this design mess is the least of their problems. But the roots of the conflict went back all the way to World War II.
They virtually, like wild dogs, put them in a pit and fight it out.
Well, and when the boss is Stalin, that's how else are you going to behave? Khrushchev was probably the best thing that space program had. The Brezhnev era was very toxic, and a guy like Chelomai, who was savvy enough to hire Nikita Khrushchev's son, but really not that great at playing the game. He was never going to get ahead in Brezhnev's world. So. Any other questions? Yes?
Didn't the Soviets just do something recently with the far side of the moon?
The Chinese. The Chinese have landed a rover on the far side of the moon, yes.
Two.
Well, right, yeah, U2 and Jade Rabbit 1 and 2. So Jade Rabbit 2 is active right now.
What do you call it, J-Rat?
Any other questions?
Snake.
Oh, yeah.
Why is the Chinese getting into the space race now?
Because they can. I mean, they can. They've got an open field.
Let's put it this way, they have the technology to do that, what else can they do? And that looks attractive to anybody who wants to poo-poo the Chinese. Chinese want to be a world player, big time, they are.
They are.
And they're
a
going
world
to show us what they can do.
They got our money to do it.
Yeah, and they knocked out a missile. What did they do? They took a satellite out. You showed us that they could do killer satellites.
Yeah.
And then we have to show them that we can knock a satellite out of the air.
They've had an
And it's
operational
like-
space station.
yeah.
They've had humans in space.
Yeah.
They can send a probe to the moon. They can send a rover to the moon. And we are not allowed to collaborate with them in any way, shape, or form. So I'm wearing here a pin that is an actual vintage Apollo Soyuz test project pin. By 1975, we were capable of going up there, docking with the Soyuz and shaking hands in space with the Soviets. We cannot legally do that in any way, shape, or form with the Chinese counterparts.
Well, that whole shaking the hand thing wasn't always well received either, because people that didn't like the Soviet Union or were brought up believing they're bad or whatever, the idea of shaking hands with them didn't sit well with everybody.
Well,
in that world.
you're never going to make everybody happy,
No.
but actually it meant a lot to the astronaut
It
and
did.
cosmonaut corps. I mean, if you see the testimony of Leonov, you know, the great cosmonaut, he was the commander of the Russian side, and we had Tom Stafford and Dean Slade on our side.
That's right.
They found that these are great American heroes going back to the Mercury project who found that a very meaningful, moving, moment in space, and a signal that we could have peace.
China now has a missile that supposedly can knock out a U.S. carrier, and they're threatening to use it if we don't get out of the China Sea. So it'll be interesting to see how far their technology goes.
And in a more peaceful note, it'll be interesting to see what India is doing, because what we've been, India's landing on the moon this year. India's space program is very much neglected at the media overall, and they are doing fascinating things. And again, they are a world player, and they do have the resources to do things that are marvelous.
And the people that live there, some of them are brilliant.
Yeah. We don't have a monopoly on the geniuses. It's not like the immediate aftermath of World War II, where the Soviets stole some of the best minds and we got the rest. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much.
Sure.